I'll never forget the moment my own son asked me to step away from the window. He didn't say it with embarrassment, he said it with disgust. I had the paintbrush in my hand, paint dripping down my fingers, and the afternoon light was hitting my face. I looked at him, not understanding, thinking it was a joke, but when he repeated the line, "Get back, Dad. If someone sees you, they'll know I'm the son of some poor old man," I felt something inside me crumble, harder than any old wall. My name is Alex Martin. I'm 62 years old, and what little I have left in this life are my hands, shaky hands, stained from years of work, from lime, from cement, from cold, and from hunger. I've been a laborer pretty much my whole life. I built other people's houses, painted roofs that were never mine, and laid foundations for homes I could never own. My only real creation was Ryan, my son. He was the one brick I cared for the most, the one I wanted to protect from the dust of poverty, and yet he was the one who broke the fastest. That day, I'd gone to his new house, excited to help him make it beautiful. He'd called me 2 weeks earlier. "Dad, I'm getting the keys to the house. Could you come help me with the painting?" "You're good at that," he said over the phone, his tone almost friendly. My eyes lit up, not because of the work, but because he had asked me, after so much time of him not asking for anything. So I grabbed my old tools, my worn-out brushes, and I went like a man heading to a meeting with the past. But before I go on, I'd love to know if you've subscribed to the channel and if you're enjoying this story. It helps me see that you support what I do and enjoy the stories I put so much heart into. Let me know in the comments what city you're listening from. All right, let's continue. When I got there, Ryan was with his girlfriend, Caroline. She was one of those women who doesn't need to say she looks down on you. You can see it in her eyes. She looked me up and down, covered her nose as if the smell of paint was my fault, and went back to checking her phone. I pretended not to notice. I smiled, because you learn that silence is the only shield you have left when life has stolen your voice. "Dad, put these gloves on," Ryan told me. "I don't want you getting stains on the new floor." I nodded. I wasn't even offended. I was so happy to be able to help him that any word from him seemed like a sacred order. So I started painting. The white paint covered the wall slowly, as if it wanted to erase my story and start a new one. While I ran the brush over the wall, I could hear him talking to Caroline. "My dad worked construction his whole life, but he never wanted to learn anything modern," she replied. "Well, at least he taught you how to work hard, right?" And they both laughed. The sound of that laughter stuck in my chest like a nail. The afternoon sun was pouring through the window, and without thinking, I got close to wipe the frame. That's when he said it. Cold, dry, without hesitating. "Get away from the window, Dad. If someone sees you, they'll know I'm the son of some poor old man." I looked at him, not with anger, but with disbelief. For a few seconds, all the noise in the world disappeared. I could only hear my own heart pounding in my ears. My son, the same boy I had carried in my arms, the one I had taught to hold a brush, was asking me to hide, to erase myself from his life. I swallowed hard. I didn't say a word. I just looked down, wiped the drop of paint running down my hand, and went back to painting. Every brushstroke was a way to keep from crying, to stop the trembling in my hands from showing, to keep being his father, even if he had stopped being my son in that instant. The rest of the day was a long silence. Caroline left early, and Ryan locked himself in a room, talking on the phone about decorations, furniture, curtains. Nothing he said had anything to do with me. I stayed in the living room, working until the light was gone. That night, I went back to my place with my back aching, my hands numb, and my heart turned to dust. I sat in the kitchen chair, the same one my wife used before she passed, and I just stared at my paint-stained fingers. I thought about my son's words over and over. Every time I replayed it in my head, it hurt more. "If someone sees you, they'll know I'm the son of some poor old man." I didn't know what hurt more, his shame or my silence. And right there, in that moment of absolute loneliness, I understood something. Kids can forget love, but they should never forget who taught them how to love. I hadn't lost him yet, but he had. I stayed up till dawn, looking at my tools, thinking about everything I'd done for him, and without knowing it, Something started inside me that night, an idea, a purpose, a tiny spark that would soon become a fire. Because sometimes, when a son wounds his father's heart, what ignites isn't resentment, it's the need to teach one last lesson that can't be erased. I've always liked my hands, not because they're beautiful, but because they're real. Every scar told a story, every callus had a reason, and every stain was a memory of something I built with love. My hands raised walls, carried bricks, supported other people's dreams, and they also cradled my son when he was just a warm bundle wrapped in a blue blanket. He was born in a public hospital on a cold January night. I was 28, and even though I didn't have money or a diploma, I swore that kid would never know the shame of poverty. And I kept that promise, at least for a while. I remember those years as a constant sound of hammers mixed with the smell of lime and sweat. I worked from sunup till the moon was high in the sky. It didn't matter if it was raining or if my knees ached, because every day meant one more brick for Ryan's future. When I watched him sleep, it was all worth it. I'd stroke his hair and promise him silently, "You're not going to go through what I did, son. You're going to have a house, books, and education, and respect." His mother, Claire, was a woman with a soft voice and gentle hands. She used to say I had my soul in my fingers. Whenever she saw me come home covered in dust, she'd hug me just the same, without worrying about getting dirty. "Don't work so much, Alex," she'd say. "The boy needs you more than he needs money." And I'd smile, because in my head, money was the way to be present, even if I couldn't be there. Claire didn't understand it then, but she never complained. She was one of those women who love without conditions, with the kind of patience only good souls have. When Ryan turned 10, I took him to a job site for the first time. I put a small hard hat on him and let him hold a brush. "Look, son," I told him, "paint covers the walls, but it doesn't erase what's underneath." He looked at me with those big, curious eyes. "And what's underneath, Dad?" "Hard work, son. And hard work is also love." For years, that was my phrase. But now, when I remember it, it hurts. Because the boy who used to admire my hands, the same one who slept bundled on my chest, ended up rejecting the very thing that defined me. When Claire got sick, Ryan was already in college. He was studying architecture in a big city on a scholarship and full of pride. We'd write him letters, send him money, and every so often we'd get photos. Him in front of modern buildings with a wide smile and clean clothes. Claire would tape them to the dining room wall like trophies. She'd say that one day, when he finished, he'd come back and build us the house we always dreamed of. I believed her, and so did she. But the sickness didn't wait for that to happen. Claire passed away one morning before dawn, my hands holding hers, and her last words were, "Promise me you'll never stop loving him, even if he changes." I nodded, and that was the hardest promise I've ever kept. Ryan came back for the funeral, wearing an expensive suit and a tense look on his face. He didn't cry. He barely hugged me. "Dad, I have to get back soon," he told me at the end. "I have a project due at the firm." "You're working already?" I asked, surprised. "Yeah, a design firm. It's important. I can't miss it." I didn't blame him. I thought it was his way of dealing with the pain. I didn't understand that it was actually his way of forgetting it. After that day, our calls became rare. He was always busy, traveling, designing, living. I was still in the same neighborhood, in the same old house, at the same old table. My tools were rusting, but my hope wasn't. Every time I got my retirement check, I'd set a little money aside. For when Ryan gets his house, I'd tell myself. And when he finally called to tell me he was moving, I felt my heart pound, like I was 20 again. I never imagined that joy would turn into this wound. That day, when he asked me to stay away from the window, I remembered all the times I'd lifted him onto my shoulders so he could see the world. I'd make him laugh. I'd say, "Look, son, everything looks better from up high." And he'd clap, his hands dirty with paint without any fear of being seen. What irony, I thought. Today he's asking me to hide from the same world I taught him to look at. A father's love is a strange thing. It doesn't go out, not even when it hurts. It turns into something deeper, quieter. Not hate, but a kind of sadness that gives you strength. That night, as I cleaned my brushes, I saw my hands reflected in the bucket of water. They were the same as always, tough, worn out, steady, but behind them, I also saw the shadow of the man my son had become, and I understood that somehow I had built him too. He was my creation, even if he now wanted to tear it down. I didn't sleep. I spent hours thinking about how unfair love can be, how you give your entire life for someone who, in the end, doesn't even want your shadow. But between the anger and the pain, something inside me started to sort through the memories, to weave an idea. A need to show him what humility, memory, and blood are really worth. Not with yelling, not with reproaches, but with something that would speak for itself, something that, even if he wanted to, he could never erase. And that was the first night I thought about leaving a mark on his wall. Not a painting, but a mirror. One where he could see himself as he truly is. I always thought you could see poverty in someone's hands, in their clothes, in the way they talked. But over time, I discovered you also see it in other people's eyes, in how they look at you, in that glint of fake compassion that has more poison than an insult. That's what I saw in Caroline the first time I met her. My son brought her home one Sunday. I'd made a stew, the table was clean, and I'd even taken out the glass tumblers we only used for birthdays. I wanted her to feel welcome. Ryan had warned me she came from a good family and to please not make any out-of-place comments. That phrase hurt more than it should have, but I pretended not to get it. I just answered, "Relax, son. I just want to meet the woman who makes you smile." When she arrived, I felt the air in the dining room change. Caroline was young, elegant, with that expensive perfume that leaves a trail even in the silence. She had a beautiful but cold face, and that way of looking at things as if she was calculating their price. She held out her hand delicately without squeezing. "A pleasure, Mr. Martin," she said, barely smiling. "Nice to meet you too," I answered, wiping my hands on my apron. During the meal, she talked almost the entire time about trips, restaurants, and their plans for the new house. Ryan watched her, fascinated, as if her every word was another goal to be achieved. I, on the other hand, watched her carefully, not because her attitude bothered me, but because I saw something in her that felt familiar, the kind of pride that isn't earned, but imitated. At one point she asked, "So what did you do for a living, Mr. Martin?" "I was a laborer my whole life, painter, mason, a little carpentry too." She nodded, faking interest. "How nice," she said with a smile that lasted about as long as a sigh. "My father owns a construction firm. Maybe you two would have gotten along." Her comment wasn't cruel, but it had an edge. Ryan didn't say anything, just looked down. I understood then that it wasn't my son speaking for himself anymore. It was her, molding his voice, his clothes, his dreams, his shame. After lunch, we went out to the backyard. She looked at the ground, the old planters, the concrete benches. "How quaint," she commented. "It looks like a set from an old movie." "Yeah," I replied. "Everything out here was made by hand." She smiled with her lips, not her eyes. Obviously, you can tell. I knew in that instant that to her, my world was a museum of failure. And yet something inside me lit up. Because what she saw as decay, I saw as history. Every crack held a memory, every stain on the wall, a sacrifice. But they would never see it, not as long as their love depended on appearances. That afternoon, after they left, the house felt emptier than ever. The smell of her perfume still hung in the air, as if reminding me that my poverty had been judged. I sat in the chair where she had been and saw the faint ring from her cup on the table. It was perfect, round, clean, and I thought my son had fallen in love with just that, with cleanliness, with brightness, with a reflection that doesn't show the truth. A few weeks went by before I saw them again. It was when he asked for my help painting the new house. I remember his enthusiasm as he talked about wall colors, the kitchen design, the furniture they were going to buy. Caroline wasn't there, but everything he said had her stamp on it. Every sentence he spoke was an imitation of her words. He had changed the way he talked, the way he dressed, the way he walked. Even the way he looked at me was different. There was no affection anymore, just a mix of pity and distance, as if he were looking at a memory he wanted to escape. I listened to him smiling, while my mind drifted back in time to when he used to run around the yard in a ripped t-shirt covered in dust, asking me to teach him how to paint. "Dad, let me try," he'd say, laughing, his hands full of color. I realized then that that little boy was still in there somewhere. hidden inside the man who was now talking about Italian lamps and Persian rugs. But he was trapped, and Caroline was the cage. One afternoon, when we went to a furniture store, I noticed something. She picked things out without looking at the price, and he pretended not to care. But I knew that look well. It was the same one I used to make when Claire wanted to buy something nice, and I knew we didn't have the money. The difference was, I did it out of love. He was doing it out of shame, out of fear of not seeming good enough for her. As we left, she looked at me politely. "Mr. Martin, thanks for coming with us. Ryan told me you have good taste in colors." "Well, years of walls," I answered with a calm smile. "Then I'll trust you with the living room. I want something modern, nothing outdated." Her gaze stopped on my worn-out shoes, and I understood perfectly what she meant to say. I was what was outdated. That night, while we were painting together, he repeated the words that would break my heart. But this time, I understood where they came from. They weren't his. They were hers. From her world of appearances, her need to erase anything humble, to dress life in luxury, to hide the shame. And that's when something inside me changed. I stopped feeling pain, and I started to feel a sense of purpose, because I understood that it wasn't enough for my son to remember me as the poor old man. He needed to remember me as the man who showed him what poverty can't take away. The truth. And in that moment, as I wiped my hands on a rag, I knew I wasn't just going to paint a house anymore. I was going to paint a lesson. The sun came through the new windows, reflecting off the freshly plastered walls. The house smelled of fresh paint, of someone else's hope, of beginnings that didn't belong to me. I had a brush in my hand and a mix of exhaustion and pride in my chest. At my age, being able to help my son build his home was almost like starting a new life, or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. Ryan was measuring a door frame, the tape measure hanging from his wrist. He was wearing a spotless white t-shirt, clean jeans, and that air of superiority he had learned from Caroline. I, on the other hand, was wearing my old overalls with the name Martin embroidered on the chest and a cap that hadn't been white for years. My hands were stained sky blue and the cracked skin burned from the turpentine. But it didn't matter. I was happy to see him there, to hear him say, "Hand me that, Dad," even if it was with reluctance. I didn't know that day would end with me painting something more than just walls. I ran the brush over the last strip of wall, careful not to leave marks. The blue color reminded me of Claire's eyes and the color of the skies when Ryan was a boy. It was then that I got close to the window to wipe the edges with a damp rag. The glass shined. I could see my reflection, an old, tired man, but still standing, and for a second I felt useful again, a part of his world. "Dad," he said without looking at me. "Yeah, son, get away from the window." "Why?" I asked, barely turning my head. "If someone walks by and sees you, they'll know I'm the son of some poor old man." It wasn't a shout. It was worse. It was a whisper, full of shame, said like he was spitting out a stain. The brush trembled in my hand. Paint dripped onto the floor, leaving an uneven mark like a tear on the wood. I didn't know what to say. I felt the air stop. The blood rushed to my head. The silence that followed was so loud that even the clock in the hallway seemed to fall silent. Ryan kept painting, pretending he hadn't said anything, as if his words hadn't just opened a wound impossible to close. I stepped away from the window. I stood still, brush in hand, looking at my paint-covered shoes. I didn't cry. At my age, you don't cry anymore. You just crack on the inside, like old walls that stay standing even though no one repairs them. I kept working. I passed the brush over and over, without thinking, without speaking. The paint was drying, but my soul was filling with invisible cracks. Every stroke was a breath held in, an apology I would never say, a love that no longer knew how to show itself. When I finished, I went to the bucket. I rinsed the brush and watched the water turn blue. The color dissolved slowly, just like the patience of a father who's starting to understand that respect isn't inherited. I stood there watching the ripples in the water, hypnotized. I saw my face reflected, and behind it, his, young, arrogant, staring at his phone. And I understood something terrible. My son no longer saw me as a father. He saw me as an embarrassment. Caroline arrived a little later, carrying a bag of food and a catalog smile. When she saw me, her lips barely twisted. "Oh, Mr. Martin, you got paint on your shoe," she said. "Yeah, it happens," I replied. "Ryan, tell him to be careful." He didn't say anything, just lowered his head, uncomfortable. I pretended not to hear, but inside, I felt something switch off. We sat on the floor to eat since the furniture hadn't arrived yet. She talked about curtains, lamps, the upcoming housewarming party. I barely touched my food. My son laughed at her comments, though his laugh sounded forced. And I thought about the times I'd fed him when we had nothing, about the nights I worked until dawn so he could study, about the promises I made to him in front of his mother's casket, and I realized I had kept all of them except one. I hadn't taught him to be grateful. When they left, I was alone in the house. The silence was so deep I could hear the echo of my own footsteps. I went back to the window. The evening light came in like a caress, turning the dust in the air to gold. I ran my fingers over the freshly painted frame and thought of Claire. "If someone sees you," the words bounced around in my mind. They hurt more than any sickness, more than any wound. But along with the pain, something began to burn. It wasn't resentment, it was clarity. That was the exact moment I understood I shouldn't respond with anger, but with truth. That words are forgotten, but what is shown remains. And that the time had come to teach my son a lesson he couldn't erase, not even with the most expensive paint in the world. I took my brush, put it in my toolbox, and stopped before leaving. I looked at the blue wall, still damp, and ran my hand over it. I left a faint handprint, an almost invisible mark. I smiled, because I knew that wouldn't be the last one. That night I walked back home under the clearest sky I could remember, and even though my hands were shaking, my mind was firm. I had found the way. My son had humiliated me in front of a window. I would teach him to look through one. There are silences that speak louder than words, and in my neighborhood, silence has a voice, too. A voice that hides behind the blinds, that murmurs from the street corners, that watches without asking. After that day at my son's house, it was that voice that accompanied me on every step back home. I walked slowly, my toolbox in one hand and the blue-stained brush in the other. The sun was setting on the old roofs, tinting the streets with that golden color that only appears when the workday ends. Every neighbor I passed greeted me with a faint smile, but in their eyes I saw something more. Curiosity, compassion, maybe pity. They knew I was helping Ryan paint his new house, and maybe they also knew, because in neighborhoods words fly, that something between us had broken. "How's the work going, Mr. Martin?" asked Mrs. Norma from the corner store. "Good, good," I lied, with a smile that hurt my face. "Your son's so lucky to have you," she said, not knowing that those words were daggers wrapped in kindness. I nodded and kept walking. I didn't have the strength to keep pretending. When I got to my house, I set my toolbox on the floor and stood still in front of the door. The paint on the facade was peeling, the doorknob was loose, and the wind made the windows moan. It was an old house, but it was mine. I had laid every brick with my own hands. Every crack told a story. But that afternoon, for the first time, I saw it through my son's eyes, as something that didn't shine, that wasn't impressive, that wasn't worth showing off. It hurt me to think that. But pain is sometimes the wisest teacher, because just when you feel your smallest, your soul starts to grow on the inside. I turned on the old radio in the kitchen. An old blues song was playing, one of those Claire loved. The melody filled the air and forced me to remember her laughter, the lunches, the Sundays, the birthdays with Ryan blowing out the candles while I held the cake with hands stained with plaster. All of it was still alive in my memory, even if my son had decided to bury it under layers of shame. I poured a glass of water and sat at the table. I looked at my hands, the same ones that had painted his house. They were ugly, yes, but they were real. And then a thought came to me, so clear it almost scared me. If he's ashamed of my hands, let him learn what they're capable of creating. The next day, I left early. The air smelled of freshly baked bread and damp earth. Some neighbors waved, others just watched me. Word was already out that Ryan was moving up, that he lived in a new neighborhood, that his girlfriend was a proper lady. And I, meanwhile, was the old laborer who still wore the same cap and the same worn-out boots. But the funny thing was, despite the gossip, nobody treated me with contempt. The neighborhood knew me. They knew who I was, where I came from, how hard I had worked. And that, silently, held me up. Mrs. Rose, the seamstress, stopped me on the sidewalk. "So, you painted everything?" she asked in that nosy but kind way of hers. "Almost everything," I replied. "Your son must be happy." I smiled. "Yeah, happy." She looked at me, hard, as if she could see right through my words. "You don't know, Mr. Martin," she said, lowering her voice, "but everyone here admires you. There are few fathers like you." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and walked away, a lump in my throat. That night, as I was getting into bed, I thought about those words. Few fathers like you. I didn't know whether to feel pride or sadness, because in the end, what good was it to be a good father if your own son couldn't see it? Sleep wouldn't come. I went out to the backyard and stared at the sky. There was a full moon. On the back wall, an old photo was still hanging. Claire, Ryan, and me at his grandparents' house. His hands were full of paint, and he was smiling at me with the innocence of someone who doesn't yet know shame. I stroked the photo. The paper was worn, but the faces were still there. That picture gave me an idea. Small, but intense. I didn't know how or when, but I had to do something to remind him who he was and where he came from. Not with anger, but with truth. The days passed slowly. Ryan didn't call. I kept to my routines, sweeping the yard, watering the plants, fixing what was broken. Sometimes, while I was sanding a piece of wood or mixing paint, I'd think about him, about how I raised him, everything I gave him, how I defended him from the world so he could dream. And now, he was returning the favor by hiding me from the world. But destiny, if you know how to wait, always leaves a sign. One afternoon, while I was painting a bench for the park, a kid from the neighborhood walked up to me. "Are you Mr. Martin, the architect's dad?" he asked, curious. "Yeah, son, that's me." "My dad says you're a genius with your hands." I smiled. That simple, honest compliment was the push I needed. I went home with a different kind of energy. I went into my workshop, opened the old trunk where I kept my tools, and saw something I hadn't touched in years. A rolled-up canvas, a box of brushes, and a can with the dried remains of oil paint. There it was. The answer. That night, under the yellowish light of the single bulb in the yard, I spread the canvas out on the table. My hands were shaking, but not from exhaustion. It was excitement. I looked at the empty canvas and whispered to myself, "If shame is born from what's forgotten, then, son, I'm going to teach you to remember." Petit butterfly. And with the first stroke of paint, the entire neighborhood, without knowing it, witnessed the beginning of my most silent and beautiful revenge, a work of art that would speak for me when I no longer had a voice. I never thought that opening that old trunk would be like opening a wound. I'd kept it stored for years in a corner of the workshop, covered by a blanket and the dust of time. It was the same trunk Claire and I had bought the day Ryan was born, to keep his first things, his drawings, his toys, the utility bills paid with sacrifice, and the letters we wrote to each other when he left for college. I'd promised not to touch it again after she died, but that night, something pushed me to. The lock was rusted. I had to force it open with an old putty knife. The shriek of the metal was like a wail. When I opened it, the smell of old paper and stored memories filled my eyes with tears. I carefully touched each object, as if the past could break if I squeezed too hard. There was a scarf Claire had knitted, yellowed by time, a notebook where Ryan had written his name in crooked letters, and at the bottom, a cardboard folder tied with string. Inside were the photographs. Not many, because we were never camera people, but each one was a universe. Ryan in his school uniform, with the torn-up sneakers he said were his lucky shoes. Ryan in the park, eating ice cream and laughing his head off. And then, the most special one, Ryan, Claire, and me, all three of us covered in paint the day we finished painting our first house. The photo was stained in one corner. I had a brush in my hand. Claire was laughing, her face smudged with white paint, and little Ryan, no older than 6, was raising his arms, proud, showing his colorful palms. It was pure happiness, trapped in an image. And on the back, in my shaky handwriting, a sentence that hit me like a distant echo. Paint fades, but love sticks to the wall. I didn't remember writing that, but reading it, I felt like Claire was speaking to me from wherever she was. That phrase was hers, I'm sure. She always believed that the simple gestures, a hot plate of food, a caress, a kind word, were what really stuck to the soul. I stared at the photo for a long time under the workshop lamp. Tears blurred my vision, but I wasn't crying from sadness. It was a mix of tenderness and clarity. I finally understood what I had to do. That image would be my answer. Not with shouts or reproaches, but with art. With the very paint he despised so much. I decided to transform it, not just copy it, but give it life, to tell with colors what words no longer could. The photo showed a family united by hard work. My painting would show a truth that can't be hidden or erased. I searched through my things for the leftover oil paints I had used years ago, back when I tried to learn from an old artist friend. The jars were dry, but they'd still work. I found brushes, rags, folded canvases. I'd forgotten how much I loved the smell of turpentine, that mix of cleaning and creation. I placed the canvas on the workbench and taped the photo next to it. I looked at it in silence. Claire was smiling, and I felt like she was giving me permission. The following days were different. I'd get up early, drink my coffee slowly, and sit in the workshop, the radio playing in the background, the sun coming through the window. And me, in front of that blank piece of cloth, ready to fill the empty spaces of my soul with meaning. The first stroke was clumsy. My hand shook, my pulse was unsteady, but little by little the color began to obey. The blue became sky again, the white became light, and the brown became earth. It was as if the memories themselves were spilling onto the canvas. Painting was like praying. Each brushstroke was an unsaid word, an apology I never heard, a caress I couldn't give. On that canvas, I saw my wife alive again, laughing, and my son innocent without any masks. It was a portrait of what we were, and also a mirror of what we lost. One afternoon, while I was painting Claire's eyes, I felt time stop. The wind came through the window and moved the photo. For an instant, I thought I heard her voice. "Don't look for revenge, Alex, just truth." I smiled, because I understood that's exactly what I was doing. My painting wouldn't be a punishment. It would be a reminder, a way of giving Ryan back what he had forgotten, his origin. When I finished the first sketch, the sun had set. I turned on the lamp and stared at it in silence. The three of them were on the canvas, Claire, Ryan, and me. But it wasn't a copy. It was a confession. The boy smiled with purity, but behind him, the shadows of his future loomed subtly. Buildings, blueprints, money, and above all, loneliness. Beside him, Claire radiated light as always, and me. I appeared just as I am now, old, tired, but with steady hands and eyes full of faith. It was more than a painting. It was a frozen story, a truth written in colors. I stored the canvas, covered it with a sheet, and let it dry. My heart was pounding like I'd just run a marathon. I knew that somehow that painting would be my voice, my silent answer to my son's shame. And though I didn't know how or when I would show it, I felt the moment would come on its own. Life, when it has outstanding debts, always finds a way to collect. That night I slept without resentment for the first time, because I understood that the deepest justice isn't imposed. It's painted. Painting at night has a confessional quality. The silence of the neighborhood, the faint hum of the power lines, the distant bark of a dog. Everything seems to listen without judging. I'd wait for the clock to strike 11 to open the workshop. I didn't want anyone to see me, not out of shame, but because some things are done better when the world is asleep. My painting had become just that, a secret. The canvas, covered by a white sheet, rested on the table as if it were breathing. Every time I lifted the cloth, I felt Claire watching me from somewhere in the painting, approving every stroke. Sometimes she'd talk to me, or at least I thought I could hear her. "Do it with love, Alex, not with anger." And I did. Because revenge born from hate rots quickly, but revenge born from love, that leaves a mark. During the day, my life went on as usual. I'd buy bread, greet the neighbors, fix little things around the neighborhood. But at night, the world would shrink to fit inside that rectangle of cloth and color. It was my refuge and my justice. Little by little, the portrait grew. It was no longer just a family painting, it had become a complete story, a kind of intimate mural where every color said something I couldn't say with words. I added details that no one would understand at first glance, but that had meaning. In the background, I painted the old house where Ryan grew up, with its peeling walls and its window always open to the wind. In the corner, a clock with no hands. It was my way of saying that time, when you truly love, stops. And in the center, between Claire and the young Ryan, were my hands outstretched, holding a brush. But the brush wasn't touching the ground. It was painting the air, the void, as if I were still building even when there was nothing left. One morning, before dawn, as I was going over the outlines, I heard a knock on the workshop door. My heart stopped. I turned off the lamp and stood still. "Dad?" a voice said on the other side. It was Ryan. I wasn't expecting him. I hadn't seen him since the day of the insult. I opened the door slowly. He was standing there, keys in hand, his face tired. "I was just passing through the neighborhood," he explained. "Wanted to see how you were." I nodded. "Fine, son. Same as always." He looked over my shoulder. "What are you doing up at this hour?" "Nothing. Just couldn't sleep." "Ah," he said, and his gaze landed on the white sheet in the back. "What's that?" "An old project," I lied. "Can I see it?" "Not yet," he shrugged. "Okay, Dad. Well, good to see you." His voice sounded empty, as if the words weighed more than his exhaustion. "Caroline and I, well, things aren't going so well," he murmured. I didn't respond. Sometimes silence is the only answer that doesn't hurt. Before he left, he gave me a pat on the shoulder. "Take care, okay?" "I always do." When he left, I went back to the canvas and lifted the sheet. His eyes, the ones in the painting, seemed to look at me more intensely than ever. And without knowing why, I added a new detail. A figure on the edge of the window, barely visible, an older man with a brush in his hand. It was me, watching him from outside. The father he wanted to hide, but who would always be there, watching. The days passed. The painting grew, and with it, my determination. I realized it wasn't enough just to paint it. I had to make it visible. I had to find a way for my son to see it, with no way to avoid it. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because he needed to face his own truth. And there is no mirror crueler or more just than memory. One Sunday, I went to visit him. Caroline wasn't there. He received me a bit more kindly, though with that distance that was now just part of how he spoke. "Want to come in, Dad?" I went inside. The house was immaculate, but empty. Cold. Everything was beige, symmetrical, perfect. Not a single photo, not a trace of childhood, not a mark of life. Just silence. I sat on the sofa and looked around. On the walls, abstract paintings without a soul. I thought about the irony of it. So much space, and not a single story hanging on the walls. He offered me coffee. While he was making it, I got up and walked around the living room. That's when I decided. My work wouldn't just be a painting, it would be an entire wall. A mural. The very one he asked me not to touch. The irony was perfect. The lesson would be right there, where his shame began. In the living room, facing the window, the place from which he asked me to hide. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started to sketch how I'd do it. I planned the proportions, calculated the colors, and chose every symbol with precision. The portrait transformed into a larger project, the secret work of my life. Something that didn't seek to humiliate, but to reveal. Love that is denied is still love, but it needs a voice. And mine would be art. That very night, I wrote a sentence in my notebook that would stay with me until the end. There are wounds that don't heal by talking, but by painting. From then on, every brush I dipped in color was a word written with my soul. Sometimes I thought about what Ryan would say when he saw it. Maybe he'd get angry. Maybe he'd be even more ashamed. Or maybe, just maybe, he'd understand that what I did wasn't to punish him, but to remind him who loved him first. I stared at the painting in the dawn light. The sun came through the window, tinting the faces on the canvas with gold, and I knew it was ready. All that was left was the final step, the place, the moment, and the signature that would seal my truth. A single word painted in the bottom right corner. Father. Going back to that house was like entering a cold temple. Nothing smelled like a home. It just smelled new, like soulless paint, like silence. The curtains were drawn, the furniture covered in plastic dust covers, the symmetrical paintings hanging on the walls as if someone had chosen them out of obligation. Everything was in order, but empty, like my son's life since he decided to erase his roots. I had waited patiently for this moment. I knew Ryan would be out of town. He'd mentioned it on the phone days earlier, with that distant politeness that strangers use when they still call each other dad and son out of habit. "We're going upstate for 3 days with Caroline. It's for work," he said. I pretended to be surprised. "That's great, son. Enjoy yourselves." But inside, I knew the time had come. That same night, I gathered my tools, my jars of paint, my brushes, and the finished canvas. Not to hang it, but to transfer it. My work wasn't going to stay in a frame. It was going to merge with the wall itself. It was going to be part of his house, his air, his history, whether he liked it or not. I got there early, before dawn. I had the spare key. He'd never changed the locks. I went in slowly, respectfully, not as an intruder, but as someone returning to his own past. The echo of my footsteps resonated on the hardwood floors. I ran my fingers over the surfaces, cold, impeccable. Nothing spoke. No photographs, no memories. Just objects, silent witnesses to a fabricated life. I turned on a floor lamp and looked at the main wall of the living room. Wide, white, perfectly smooth. Right there, facing the window where he had asked me to stay away. I was going to leave my truth. I took out the canvas and leaned it against the table. I looked at it one last time. Claire, Ryan, and me. All three of us smiling, covered in paint. That image, that purity, was what I was going to give back to him. But not with a simple painting. With a mural. A living history that no ashamed son could cover up. I took a deep breath, opened the jars. The smell of turpentine filled the room, and for an instant, I felt time reverse. I felt Claire was with me, that my son was little again, laughing among the paint stains. I closed my eyes and began. The first stroke was long, sure, decisive. The blue of the sky I had once painted for his childhood. Then the warm brown of our old house, Claire's hands, the little boy's gaze. I painted slowly, without rushing, like someone praying. Every line had a meaning, every shadow, a memory. The clock in the hallway marked the hours, but I didn't feel them. It was as if the entire night belonged to me. It was raining outside. The drops hit the glass and slid down like tears. Inside, the yellow light from the lamp illuminated the mural as it began to come to life. In the center, I painted the figure of Ryan as a boy, a brush in his hand, looking up, smiling. At his side, Claire, surrounded by light, and behind him, my own figure, barely visible but steady, holding the brush with pride. There was no sadness in that face, only peace. Every stroke was a confession, every color, a truth I couldn't keep quiet. I was giving him back his history. I was teaching him without words that poverty wasn't a disgrace, but an inheritance of dignity. I stopped for a moment to look at the scene from a distance. The painting seemed to be breathing. The boy on the wall looked at me with tenderness, as if he recognized me. And then I understood something. That mural wasn't just for Ryan. It was for me too. A way to close the circle, to make peace with my own silence. I spent 2 whole days working. I ate little, slept almost nothing. I only stopped when the sun came through the window, turning the painted faces to gold. On the 3rd day, the mural was almost complete. Only one detail was missing, the signature. I took a fine-tipped brush, dipped it in red paint, and in the bottom corner, I wrote one word that weighed more than my own name. Father. Nothing else, no last name, no explanation, because being a father doesn't need a signature. I stepped back. The wall seemed to have a soul. It was as if the whole house was breathing differently. It wasn't an empty space anymore. It was a testimony, a memory impossible to ignore. I packed up my things. Before I left, I sat for a while in silence, facing the mural. The rain had stopped. The only sound was the faint dripping of water from the eaves. I stared at the painting of my life, the portrait no one asked me for, but that my soul demanded I make. I smiled, because I knew I had done it, not with vengeance, but with love, with the love that is painted in silence, but is etched forever. I turned off the lamp, closed the door carefully, and walked out into the early morning with a peaceful heart. As I walked away, I realized something curious. Nothing hurt, not my body, not my soul. It was as if every stroke of that mural had healed an old wound. That morning when I got home, I turned on the radio. An old folk song was playing. I poured some coffee and sat by the window. I looked at my hands, stained with color, and thought, it's done. I didn't know how Ryan would react when he saw it. Maybe he'd be furious. Maybe he'd cry. But something inside me said that when the truth is painted from the heart, no heart can remain untouched. Justice doesn't always come in the form of punishment. Sometimes it comes as a painted wall, as a mirror that doesn't lie, as a love that endures even contempt. That was my way of speaking to him, of telling him that I'm still here, that a poor father isn't an embarrassment, but a reminder of everything a son forgets when he's blinded by pride. And so, with my hands still stained, I prayed in silence. Claire, my love, it's done. Our story is back home. The morning my son came back from his trip, the day dawned clear, almost serene. I woke up before dawn, not knowing why. The air smelled different, as if it sensed something important was about to happen. I made coffee, sat in front of the window, and waited in silence, my heart restless, my hands still stained with dried paint. I wasn't scared, but I had a kind of internal tremor, like someone about to witness the destiny he himself had written. The hours passed. In the distance I heard a car engine. I looked out and saw it, Ryan's gray car parking in front of the new house. He got out first with his usual expression of hurry and exhaustion. Then Caroline, impeccable, in a light-colored dress and dark sunglasses, carrying a bag with flowers. They looked like a postcard. Perfect. And I, from a distance, watched them with a mix of tenderness and sadness. It was my son, the same boy who once ran barefoot through the mud in our backyard, and now, without knowing it, he was about to look his own reflection right in the face. I don't know what I felt first when they opened the door. Maybe the silence, a different, thick silence, as if the air in the house had weight. They walked in, laughing about something they were discussing, and suddenly they froze. I could see Caroline drop the flowers. The dry sound of the stems hitting the floor was the only thing that broke the silence. Ryan took a step forward, not understanding. His breathing changed. I watched him from the sidewalk across the street, through the window. Yes, that same window, the one he asked me never to come near. In front of them, on the white wall of the living room, was the mural. Lit by the light coming in, it looked alive. The painting vibrated, it breathed. The three of us were there, Claire, Ryan, and me. She, smiling, the boy, raising his brush to the sky, and me, behind them, watching with pride. The colors shined with a purity that hurt. The blue of the sky, the brown of the earth, the white of hope, and in the corner, my red signature. Father, Ryan put his hands to his head. No, he muttered, that can't be. Caroline took a step back. What is this? She asked, as if the painting was an insult. It's, he stammered, it's my father. She looked at him, confused. Your father? Yeah, he said, almost in a whisper. He painted this. His eyes filled with tears, but he didn't cry. He just kept staring at the wall, as if time had suddenly caught up with him. I, from the sidewalk, stood still. The wind moved my shirt, but I didn't care. I felt my entire soul clench in my chest, not with pride, not with revenge. It was something bigger, the weight of a revealed truth. Inside the house, Caroline turned to him. And why would he do something like this? She asked, annoyed. Ryan didn't answer. He walked closer to the mural, reached out and touched the painted figure of his mother. The color still seemed warm, as if it were breathing. Because I forgot who I am, he finally said in a low voice. What are you saying? Look at it, Caroline, he whispered. This is my life. My father painted it with the hands I wanted to hide, the same hands that gave me everything, the same hands that built what I have, and He stopped, swallowing hard. I despise them. She crossed her arms. "Don't be dramatic, Ryan. It's just a painting." He looked at her with a mix of anger and sadness. "No, Caroline, it's not a painting. It's my shame hanging on the wall. And it's also his forgiveness." She didn't say anything else. She turned around and walked out of the living room. Her heels echoed on the floor like a judgment. Ryan was left alone. I kept watching him from outside, through the glass, not daring to get closer. He knelt in front of the mural, touched the word Father with his fingertips, and as he did, he broke down crying. A silent, choked cry, as if he was struggling to breathe, and in that moment, everything he had held back for years seemed to collapse. I saw his body tremble, his head hang low, and I understood that he was no longer the arrogant man who had pushed me away from the window. He was my son again. I watched him for a long time, and then something inside me moved. Not the urge to go in, or to talk to him, or even to console him. Just a deep certainty. It was done. I didn't need to say anything. And the wall spoke for me. The art had done what love hadn't been able to. It had reached his soul. I turned around and walked away slowly. I didn't want him to see me. As I turned the corner, I heard a choked cry, his broken voice calling my name. "Dad!" But I didn't stop, not because I didn't want to, but because I understood the call wasn't for me. It was for the man he himself had forgotten, and that man was now alive in the mural. Later, when the sun began to set, I went back home, turned on the radio, poured a cup of coffee, and sat in silence. The phone rang. I looked at the screen. Ryan. I didn't answer, not out of resentment, but because sometimes silence is the only way to let the other person hear what they never knew how to listen to. I let the phone ring until it stopped. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years, without guilt, because I understood that you don't have to destroy in order to teach. You just have to remember. And my mural was just that, a living memory, a lesson painted with the soul. The next day when I went out to the backyard, a white butterfly landed on my window. I don't know why, but I smiled. I felt it was Claire, watching me from somewhere in the sky, and I knew everything was in its place. 2 days passed before Ryan dared to come see me. I knew it was him by the footsteps. I always recognized his walk, firm but with a slight drag at the end, as if the world weighed on his heels. That afternoon, I was in the backyard, sanding an old bench, when I heard the door open without a knock. I didn't turn around. I just kept working, letting the sound of the sandpaper fill the silence. "Dad," he said, barely audible. I looked up slowly. He was standing there, his face pale, his eyes swollen. He was wearing the same suit he'd worn on his trip, but now it looked too big for him. I looked at him without saying anything. The wind moved the dry leaves on the ground, as if time itself had stopped to listen to us. "Dad, I need to talk to you," he repeated. I nodded. "So talk." He hesitated. "What I did. The painting day. The window." He paused, his voice trembling. "I was an idiot." I didn't try to deny it. I just kept watching him. He looked down. "I saw the mural," he said. "I saw Mom." His voice broke. I never thought a wall could hurt so much. I stayed silent for a few seconds before answering. "It wasn't meant to hurt you, son." "I know," he whispered. "That's why it hurts more." He took a few steps closer. "I don't know when I became someone capable of being ashamed of you. You gave me everything. You taught me how to work, how to get back up, and I wanted to hide you. I'm not going to talk about the past," I told him softly, "but I need to ask you to forgive me. You don't have to ask me for anything, Ryan." "Yes, I do," his voice trembled, "because I realized something. I wasn't ashamed of you. I was ashamed of me, of having forgotten who I was." His words landed slowly, heavy and true. I watched him, feeling that the boy who once painted with me was slowly returning under that skin of a repentant adult. I got closer and put a hand on his shoulder. My hands were rough, but firm. "Son," I said, "we all forget who we are sometimes. The important thing is to remember in time." He looked up. He was holding back tears, but there was a different light in his eyes. "I went to the house," he continued. "I sat in front of the mural all night. I couldn't stop looking at it. At first, I felt shame. Then, gratitude. because I finally understood what you were trying to tell me without saying it. That love isn't painted with words, but with sacrifice. His sentences cut through me like sweet knives. I looked at him and smiled, just barely. Then the mural did its job. And what was that? He asked through his tears. To remind you that you can't wash away blood with money, that no new house can erase the home where you learned to love. Ryan took a deep breath. He took one more step and, without thinking, he hugged me. It was an awkward hug, the hug of a grown man becoming a son again for just an instant. It took me a few seconds to respond. When I did, I felt all the years of distance dissolve in that gesture. The air smelled of paint, of wood, of memory. We stood like that, in silence, for a long time, until he murmured, "I want you to come with me, Dad." "Where to?" "Home. I want you to live with me." I shook my head, smiling. "No, son. I've already painted everything I needed to paint. The house is yours now. And what I left you, that can't be erased." He looked down, understanding. "Then at least let me come see you every week." "That I'll allow," I said. "But bring your brush. It's been a while since we painted together." Ryan laughed through his tears, and that sound, so simple, so human, was the most beautiful music I'd heard in years. When he left, I watched the door close. The sun was setting behind the wall, painting the sky orange and gold, and I thought that, sometimes, this is what life is, painting over the wounds until you can see the love again. They say time erases everything. It's not true. Time only reveals what's worth keeping, and what Ryan and I rebuilt after that hug was just that, the essential. We were no longer a father and son separated by shame, but two men learning, in the silence, how to forgive each other. He started coming on Sundays. At first, he wouldn't stay long. We'd have coffee on the porch. We'd talk about simple things, work, the weather, the neighbors. Avoiding the past was a way of not breaking the newfound peace, but over time, the conversations got longer, more sincere. One day he told me, "I went by the old neighborhood, Dad." "Oh yeah?" I asked without looking up from my coffee. "Yeah. I drove past the house where I grew up. The walls are still standing, but the color is all worn out." "Just like me," I replied, smiling. He laughed, and that laugh erased years of distance. From then on, something new started. Ryan didn't just visit alone anymore. He'd bring brushes, rollers, cans of paint. "We're going to fix this place up, Dad," he'd say, and I'd let him, watching in silence as the same son who once humiliated me for my stained hands now imitated them with pride. His movements were clumsy at first, but loaded with tenderness. Every time he passed the brush over the wall, I saw the boy I was once able to teach, the same one who had forgotten his roots, but was now repainting them with his own hands. One afternoon, while we were working together, Ryan stopped. "You know, Dad," he said, "I've been thinking." "That sounds dangerous," I replied, and we both laughed. "I want to do something more with the mural." "Like what?" I don't want to erase it or cover it. I want to open the house to other people. Let them see it. Let them know who you were." "That's not necessary, son," I said. "Yes, it is. Because if there's one thing I learned from you, it's that honest work deserves to be seen. And that mural isn't just a story, Dad. It's your life. It's our heritage." I just looked at him in silence. For the first time, I understood that I didn't need justice or redemption. I already had it, right in front of me. My son wanted to honor what he had once tried to hide, and that was worth more than any apology. In the following months, Ryan kept his promise. He restored the house, left the mural untouched, and placed a small plaque next to it with a sentence engraved on it. "Paint fades, but love sticks to the wall." When I saw it, I felt a lump in my throat. It was the same sentence I had written on the back of that old photo that inspired everything. The circle had closed. Caroline was no longer in his life. I knew it from him, though he never mentioned the details. He only said, "Some people can't stand anything real," and I understood perfectly. Sometimes sincerity scares away those who live for appearances, but in his eyes there was no longer resentment. There was peace. He had learned the lesson life had painted on his own wall. Over time, the house became a meeting place. Kids from the neighborhood would stop by to look at the mural. Ryan would explain to them who the man who painted it was. "He was my father," he'd say with pride. I'd listen from the back, without interrupting, my heart full. Every word he spoke was one more brick in the rebuilding of our love. One afternoon, as the sun was setting, he walked over and handed me something. A new paintbrush. "This is for you, Dad." "What for?" I asked. "So you can keep painting. There are still walls that need color." I smiled. "No, son. Now it's your turn. I've already painted what I needed to." He fell silent, looking at the horizon. Then he placed the brush on the table and said, "Then I'll paint for you." And he did. From that day on, every Sunday, we'd paint together. It didn't matter what. A door, a fence, an old wall in the neighborhood. The important part was the act, the union, the paint-stained hands side by side, father and son at peace again. I learned something in that time. Forgiveness isn't spoken, it's painted. And when the soul is cleansed, even the dullest color shines again. Sometimes while we worked, I'd feel Claire's presence with us. The wind would move the curtains, the leaves would dance, and the smell of fresh paint would fill the air. It was her way of telling us she was happy. And I, looking at my son, would just think, it was worth every brush, every tear, every silence. Because sometimes the real legacy isn't the things we leave hanging on the walls, but the marks we leave on the hearts of those who learn to see differently. Sometimes I think life is like a freshly painted wall. At first, it shines, then it dulls, and over the years it starts to show the marks of time. But if you look closely, between the cracks, there's always something beautiful left. The story of everything it endured without falling. A few days ago, Ryan finished painting the last wall in the neighborhood. I watched him from the shade of the porch with a cup of coffee in my hand and a quiet soul. His movements were firm, confident. He was no longer the young man who was afraid to get his hands dirty. Now, every stroke he made was an act of love, and as I watched him, I understood that nothing more needed to be said. Everything I ever wanted to teach him was right there, in that repeated silent gesture, painting as someone who is both asking for forgiveness and giving thanks at the same time. The sun was starting to set. The air smelled of fresh paint and damp earth. Ryan walked over, wiped his hands on a rag, and sat down next to me. "You know, Dad," he said, "when I was a kid, I thought stained hands were for poor people. Now I understand they're for people who are alive." I looked at him and smiled. "And for people who love," I replied. He nodded. We didn't say anything else. We didn't need to. Since then, I no longer dream about what hurt me. I dream of new walls, of clean brushes, of laughter echoing between the bricks. The mural in his house is still there, untouched. Sometimes the neighbors tell me they look at it when they pass by and feel something in their chest, a kind of calm, as if they're remembering something they had forgotten. That's enough for me. Because I understood that art, like love, doesn't seek recognition, it seeks permanence. Every morning when the sun comes through my window and lands on my hands, I see the complete story of my life in them. Hands that built, that held, that trembled, and that, in the end, taught. There is no greater pride, no more beautiful home than that of forgiveness. Today, as I write these last lines, I feel my story is finished, but not with a period, with a brushstroke. The last one, the softest one, the one that doesn't fade. Because even if the years quiet my voice and time steals my steady hand, I know that every wall I painted, every color I left behind, and every person's gaze I touched with my hands will remain. And if one day my son remembers me, or someone sees my mural and stops for a second, I only want them to think one thing. A poor man doesn't leave behind money. He leaves behind colors, and with them, he leaves behind love. Sometimes words aren't enough, and only silence, colors, and memories can tell what the heart keeps quiet. Alex taught us that a father can't be erased, that even as time passes and walls wear down, true love always leaves its mark. Tell me in the comments what city you're listening from. If this story moved you, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel to keep sharing stories that remind us that true love paints life forever.